Welcome to Evidence Based, a New Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking about psychological flexibility. We're joined by Dr. Diana Hill. Dr. Hill is the co-author of the ACT Daily Journal. She is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Santa Barbara, California, where she provides therapy, high-performance coaching, and training to mental health professionals in acceptance and commitment therapy. She is co-host of Psychologist Off the Clock podcast and is passionate about integrative health, homesteading, and parenting with intention. Hi, Diana. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So we like to start the conversations with an establishing question, and ours for you today is, what is psychological flexibility?
That is a big question to start with. And I could talk for the next hour and not actually get to the end of that answer. So I will try and simplify it, which is actually a lot of my mission in life right now, is trying to take these concepts from psychology that have such a strong evidence base and make them digestible and applied to people's lives. So I do that as a therapist, and I do it as a writer and as a teacher. But psychological flexibility is one of those concepts that has been researched for decades now. There's a strong evidence base behind it. And what it is your ability to stay present and engaged in what matters to you in your life, even when difficult stuff shows up. And that difficult stuff are things like thoughts and feelings and sensations that make us quite uncomfortable. How do you stay aligned with your values in those important moments of your life?
That's a great summary. And in practical sense too, what does being psychologically flexible look like? Like a good example of it.
Well, we can think about it in different domains of our life. So I'm a parent, and psychological flexibility as a parent is something like when my kids are fighting in the back of the car and I want to yell back at them, pausing, getting present, remembering the type of mom that I want to be, and responding from my values, right? I'm also a partner. So same deal, psychological flexibility in partnership may be when you are in a fight with somebody that you love, being able to get behind their eyes and see their perspective and recognize that there are many rights here. There is no one right perspective. And then also be able to act from the type of person, the type of partner you want to be, acting from a place of love. So you could do it as a partner, you can do it as a parent, you can do it at work, as a therapist, as a client, and you can do it in big places like taking action for social justice or climate change. So from small daily activities to big things in your life.
I like the example of being a parent and also in a partnership or a relationship, because I think those are two of the biggest areas where it can be hard to remain present and kind of connect back to those values, even though they're two of the most important areas to do that. And as we're talking about values, how does psychological flexibility tie into acceptance and commitment therapy?
Yeah, I think of acceptance and commitment therapy is one avenue to teaching and experiencing these processes that underlie psychological flexibility. So when I'm working with clients, I often talk about, or when I'm working with therapists, I often talk about psychological flexibility as sort of like a Rubik's Cube, where there's these 6 sides to the Rubik's Cube, which are the 6 processes in ACT that we're going to be working on. And those 6 processes interact with and influence each other. They're things like you mentioned, being present, your values. What do you do with your thoughts? How do you practice acceptance? How do you take committed action towards what you care about in your life? How do you perspective take in the moment, right? So these different sides of that Rubik's Cube and how you practice them is ACT. And ACT has a really nice, flexible approach that honors, clients' individual differences, their context, has a lot of techniques, things like metaphor, using experiential exercises in session. And really the ultimate goal is to help your client become more psychologically flexible in their life, and also for you as a therapist to be as psychologically flexible as possible, because those are very related.
So diving in a little bit to those core processes you mentioned, how do those lead us to psychological flexibility?
Well, I mentioned they're sort of like this Rubik's Cube. And I think it always helps to give examples, right? So the 6 core processes, and this is what Debbie and I write about in the Act Daily Journal. We actually intentionally broke it down 1 chapter per process and just practice one at a time. The 6 core processes are: 1 is acceptance. So being able to be open to whatever shows up under your skin without fighting it. A second one is being present. A third one is perspective taking. 4th is your values. 5th is stepping back from your thoughts. And 6th is committed action. So the question is sort of like, how do they lead you to being more psychologically flexible? You could take each one of those and see how they would play out with psychological flexibility. I'll give an example, really kind of boring, simple example from my life. Last week, I was in my yoga class that I taken this yoga class for a number of years. And I did sort of the cardinal sin of yoga, which is when the yoga teacher said, okay, everybody, you have a choice now. You can go into an arm balance pose. I looked over at the person next to me and compared myself. You're not supposed to do that in yoga, right?
That's the worst.
It's the worst, right? But here's the thing. It's actually what I did with that comparison that was psychologically flexible. So it wasn't that I comparing yourself is right or comparing yourself is wrong, because guess what minds do? They compare. Okay, so we know that about the mind. There is no yogi that hasn't looked at some other yogi at some point in time. But it's what I did next. So the teacher said, okay, we're going to go into this side, it's called side crow, which is basically you're balancing your body on one elbow to the side with your feet off the ground. And I looked at this person who was probably 55 years old, this woman next to me, who was doing it. And in that moment, I had a twinge of regret. And the regret was all of the classes for the past 20 years where I hadn't tried that pose. And I hadn't tried it because I didn't want to fall on my face. And so I looked at her and I said, you know what? There is nothing that is different between this woman and me. The only difference is that she was psychologically flexible and she fell on her face more times than I did. And so I used that regret. I used that uncomfortable emotion. I didn't run from it. I actually allowed it to teach me something in that moment. And I tried. And if I keep trying between now and when I'm 55, I may just be able to do that pose. I may not, but I won't have that feeling of like avoidance of something. So that's psychological flexibility. I mean, that's sort of a simple thing, but we can think about, listeners can think about for themselves all those moments that they didn't step into because there was something uncomfortable there. And then what gets lost? The vitality, the vibrancy, the fullness of your life. And maybe it's a moment of like, yeah, I can't, do a side pose, balance pose in yoga, but it may have been that job that you didn't try out for, or maybe in that social situation you didn't go to because you were anxious, or maybe it was not speaking up and saying something when you felt inside that I really need to say something right now, not setting a boundary. All the things that we do in life that we avoid, that we don't step into those moments. And that's psychological inflexibility. So psychological flexibility is about showing up even in the presence of those obstacles.
I really love that story because I've definitely been the person in a yoga class committing that sin of looking over and not going for an inversion or something else. And so I can relate to that moment very much. And you've mentioned throughout so far how you can apply psychological flexibility in practice as a therapist. Could you explain what that would look like as a clinician and why it's important to be psychologically flexible as a clinician?
Yeah, I just attended the ACBS World Conference, and one of the sessions that I attended was with Lauren Borges, Robin Walzer, Sean Barnes, and it was on moral injury. And moral injury comes out of the VA where veterans, and it actually started with veterans talking with pastors, because that was actually the one place, the chaplains was the one place where a veteran can share everything, and it's not going to be shared anywhere else. Even with their mental health providers, the mental health providers report to somebody in the VA. So these chaplains were reporting on what the chaplains were receiving these stories of clients. I'm going to get to your answer. Don't worry. I tell a story to get there. The chaplains were receiving these stories of these clients, and they were these really painful stories of things like, I witnessed somebody being raped, and I called in to command, and they told me that I couldn't do anything to stop it. And I've been holding that memory and that image in my mind for the last 30 years, 20 years. And now I'm suicidal, and I'm drinking, and I'm doing all these things to get rid of it. So where does this come in terms of psychological flexibility of the therapist? The bravery of those therapists in the VA to step into hearing the stories of their clients and staying with them in the story long enough to uncover the values that are underneath that moral injury, and then helping the client walk through their life and that history and that memory to get to a place of, living again. It takes a tremendous amount of bravery on the part of the client, but also the part of the therapist. And the therapist needs to be psychologically flexible, because they need to deal with all the stuff that's showing up under their skin, their desire to leave, their desire to not go there and ask that question, their desire to not feel what their client's feeling. And that's just one example. I mean, I think Lauren Borges is one of the most, courageous, psychologically flexible, brave people that I know now from having heard what she does for a living. My goodness. But every garden variety therapist, including myself, has experienced that, like that urge to run when a client brings up their suicidality or depression or trauma, or, someone that works with OCD and has sexual obsessions. I mean, that's a hard thing to sit in the room with. And it's our courage and our psychological flexibility in doing that allows our clients to sit in the room with it too.
Yeah, that's so important. And it can get really heavy, I imagine. And a core of what you've been saying is about being present. So what are some ways that you can be present and keep yourself present? Because I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to stay in that moment, or especially like you're talking about with clinicians, how do you stay in that moment with your client, and how do you stay in the moment when it's difficult?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that Debbie and I talk about is being present where it matters most, right? So we can't all be mindful all of the time, but we can be mindful in the moments that are important moments to be mindful. And one of the really simple tools and techniques that I learned many years ago that I use a lot and teach a lot with my clients is just this practice of one eye in and one eye out. And the practice of one eye in and one eye out is first remembering to take two eyes in and being present with what's happening inside of you. So we can even do this as you and I, we're on a screen. There's some evidence, there's something called Zoom apnea, which is you're less likely to breathe when you're on Zoom. You breathe less. So we can take a moment.
So true.
Have you been breathing for the last 15 minutes? I haven't.
When you just said that, I was like, oh, wow, I haven't.
Yeah. So we can take a moment to turn our two eyes in. Am I breathing? What's happening inside of me? Where's my discomfort, my anxiety, my mind? What's my mind up to? Just sort of like two eyes into my landscape. What do I need in this moment? Do I need to adjust my back a little bit? And then we can also get present with two eyes out, of not only two eyes out between the three of us having this conversation. Here we are, but also being present with the larger context. What is this conversation for and about? The listeners who are present right now listening, the people in our lives who are present that have made this possible for me to be here and not have kids running in the room, right? So two eyes out to what's happening also just in the context and in the moments that we're in. And then the ultimate being present, I think, is our ability to toggle back and forth. So to remember to turn one eye in, what's happening inside of me? Am I breathing? What's happening inside? And then one eye out, what's happening with you? And what do I care about in this moment? And how can I engage in that care in this conversation? So one eye in, one eye out, we can bring that to pretty much anything we do in life.
I definitely was very aware of my breathing during that entire answer. And I think that staying present is such a challenge, although obviously so important, especially to bringing awareness back to yourself. And kind of in line with that, when we're talking about ACT or psychological flexibility, one of the important pieces of it is intentionality. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important to keep that in focus while you're working through this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different angles when you use the word intentionality, or things that come to my mind for me. I mean, I think one thing that comes to mind is values. Like, how is it your intentionality is maybe how you want to show up in this moment. And in ACT, values are more verbs and adverbs than they are nouns. So it's like, I have the intention to be kind, or I have the intention to be truthful, or the intention to be authentic, right? Or vulnerable. So I think intentionality can boil down to values and how you want to be moment to moment, and staying true to that, and then noticing when you've moved out of it. And that, as we all do, I mean, it's like back to yoga again. It's like a balance pose. There is no person that is still in a balance pose. They're constantly making micro adjustments around their center. I also think intentionality is helpful because it links to another process of ACT, which is perspective taking, and that ability to kind of zoom out beyond this moment, as I did. So I did a little perspective taking with you all when I said, think about all the listeners that are here that are listening. Do you notice how that shifted your perspective from us on just the three of us to like a bigger perspective? There was some intentionality in that perspective taking, because what it does is it allows you to see the bigger picture, the bigger intention of your work and your life. So perspective taking can be like, okay, at the end of my life, looking back, what's important to me, or currently in my life, looking back to earlier in my life, how do I wish I had done things differently? And those can all inform our intentionality. How that plays out in the therapy room is also just the intentionality of the therapist, having a theoretical orientation, having an understanding of a functional analysis of like, what is the function of this behavior that I'm doing as a therapist? What is the function of my client's behavior? So intentionality also plays out in the therapy room as well.
So you mentioned perspective taking, and you talk a lot about that in your book. And along those lines, you talk about a sky mind as it relates. Is that something different than what you explained by expanding out, or can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
So perspective taking is the process and ACT that is also known as self as context. And of all the misunderstood processes, it is the one. And there's many ways to talk about self as context, perspective taking. And it's actually the chapter that when Debbie and I were writing ACT Daily together, we struggled with the most. Of like, how are we going to teach this thing? We don't really understand it ourselves. So and so here's one way we taught it with Sky Mind. And Sky Mind actually comes from it's a Buddhist philosophy, a Buddhist teaching, where if you think about sort of your mind like the sky, and your emotions and your feelings, those are feelings, your emotions and your thoughts and your beliefs and your memories as the weather systems that come in, right? So when you are in a fight with your mom, you might be in a foggy sky mind or stormy sky mind, right? So that storm of anger towards your mom, or the fog of not seeing clearly, right, shows up. And your mind at the back, the sky mind, is the mind that loves her. Is the mind that just is like present, right? Like, this is my, that it just has this, this relationship, right? But the weather system comes in. And so when you practice perspective taking, you start to see that no matter how bad that weather gets, it cannot harm my sky mind. And no matter how bad that weather gets, it's going to pass. And another weather system will come in, and I may see things differently at a different point in time. It has sort of an impermanence quality to it, which self as context does. So sky mind is your capacity to sit in the sky and observe the weather from a little bit of a distance. And there's many ways you can do that. I mean, I think meditation practice is one way that people practice cultivating sky mind. That's how I personally practice it. But that's not the only way. There's other ways to work on and cultivating this observer self.
I really like the weather analogy to different, phases of your being, or moods rather, because I'm a very seasonally oriented person. And so I think of things like that often in my mind as it is. But so I appreciate that. And I wanted to talk about going back a little bit when we were talking about having some of those unpleasant experiences and learning to kind of let them exist with the positive and not avoiding them. How are some ways that we do that? Or how are some ways we learn to stop avoiding and letting them be a part of our experience?
The place I start with clients is not stopping avoiding, but looking at the cost of avoidance. So in ACT, it's called creative hopelessness. And the idea is not to get our clients to feel hopeless about themselves. That's not the goal. But the goal is to help them get hopeless about what they are doing to avoid, right? And so we start to look at like, okay, what is it you want your life to be about? What are the barriers between where you are and what you want your life to be about? And what happens when you come up against those barriers? What do? There's some common avoidance strategies. So like if one of the things that I want to do is I want to write another book. What are the barriers that show up? I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. And gosh darn it, people don't like me. It's sort of the opposite of the Stuart Smiley story, right? So those show up. And then what do I do when those barriers show up? I procrastinate. I don't do anything. I don't reach out to that person. I avoid, right? And for some other people, the ways that they may avoid, maybe like I drink, I smoke, I eat, I don't eat, I run a lot. For somebody else, it might be I problem solve. I get really intellectual about it. I write a paragraph and then I edit that paragraph for 3 hours so I don't get anywhere. For some people, their avoidance may be I don't go, or I try not to think about it. I distract myself. So there's these common sort of like emotional avoidance strategies that we all do. And the metaphor I often used with clients is that it's sort of like it's like you're on a roundabout. And we have a lot of roundabouts here in Santa Barbara. We didn't used to, but I remember it was like maybe a decade ago, they just started putting it was like, this is the traffic solution, is the roundabout. And Californians, I'm in Santa Barbara, Californians are terrible drivers. We're known for being terrible drivers. And you put a roundabout in the city of like Santa Barbara, people are freaked out. They don't know what to do. So you get on the roundabout and you go around and around and around and around, right? So that's experiential avoidance. What are the costs of that? What are the costs? Like you don't, you have all the costs associated with the things that you're doing to avoid. The feeling of hangover, the physical costs of, over exercising, the costs, but there's also a cost of you not living the life you want to live. So I start there. Creative hopelessness. What are the costs? And then the next step is once you get hopeless enough about your behaviors, not hopeless about yourself, but once you get hopeless enough about your avoidance behaviors, then you start to have this opening of willingness. And the opening of willingness is, you see that exit ramp on the roundabout, that street, like if you moved over a lane and you went on, like you have the willingness to make that move, which is really scary. And you practice things like acceptance and being present and cognitive diffusion to make it. And then once you're off the roundabout, here's the cool thing. You can go on any street you want in town. Where do you want to go? What do you want your life to be about? That part is sort of like the committed action values part of ACT. But we got to start with it's not working for you. And I think one of my big errors as a therapist is I go straight to like, okay, well, let's like go do this. Let's go make the change. Let's go get you going on, signing up for Tinder. There's some barriers there. And we got to look at what the barriers are and help the person get to the place of creative hopelessness.
I think that summarizes it. I love the roundabout metaphor. My sister lives in Santa Barbara, and I've been angry at those roundabouts, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I want to talk a little bit more about values. We've talked a lot about them in passing. For someone who's new to this type of work or to ACT, how can you identify your values? Is there an easy activity where you can figure it out, or does it sort of come up naturally? Or what are some ways to find those values so that we know how to align our life moving forward?
I love that question. Everyone wants like the values list. Give me the list of values so I can pick my top 3. And I think sometimes we do that as therapists. We're like, I have this list. What are your top 3? That's one way to look at values. I look at values not necessarily as like even like a word that you could put down. I mean, maybe we could put down a word, but there's 2 entry points. One entry point is what hurts? What hurts in your life? What do you regret? What is painful right now? And as we've learned, we can't have a podcast about ACT without talking about its founders, Stephen Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Kirk Strassel, and the many people that have taken this concept and added to it and researched it and, created this beautiful approach. But Steve often, he's sort of well known for saying, values and pain are 2 sides of the same coin. So you can start with what hurts. And oftentimes that's when people are coming into therapy with me, it's because something hurts. So therefore, the bigger the hurt, the bigger the value that's driving it, right? That's one avenue in. So if you look at what hurts and then you look at, okay, what is it that I care about that's contributing to this hurt? I'm coming in because I'm in a fight with my sister and I haven't, she drives me nuts and I haven't talked to her in, years, and our kids used to be friends and they're not playing together anymore. And okay, so there's a hurt there. Do you think this person doesn't care about their sister or doesn't care about, of course they care so much. That's why it hurts so much. Then the other avenue in to begin to explore values is what brings you vitality. When you do it, you get into this sense of flow and you feel this like lifting up of, oh my gosh, this is how I want to be. This brings me so much sense of meaning and purpose and depth. And it's not always like a good feeling. Sometimes it's like an uncomfortable feeling, but it's like a deep tissue massage kind of vitality, So that's another avenue. And as a therapist, I see myself as like a values highlighter. I'm always looking for that. Like, oh, this is a moment where a client started to talk and I'm noticing they're getting into it as they're talking about it, there's vitality here. So there's probably a value. And values, again, are how you show up, like how you are showing up in your life. If someone is videotaping you at the end of the day, and you were to watch that video, what are the moments that demonstrate how you want to be in the world? And what are the moments that demonstrate how you don't want to be in the world? Those are your values. So yes, we can boil it down to being adventurous and courageous and kind and, all those adjectives that are useful. But for me, it's sort of like an inside job of knowing your values.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting-edge, evidence-based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strassel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com.
I think it's really funny that your first example was that people want the list of values. I did values work in a yoga teaching seminar, and it's really uncomfortable work in the beginning because you're looking for a little bit of guidance, or like you said, kind of looking over at other people like, okay, what are your values? Because it's hard to sit with that thought from scratch and figure out what they are. So I really appreciate rounding out that answer and looking at it kind of, as we've said, in a zoomed out perspective as to what it looks like in the big picture of your life. And going back to something you mentioned earlier in the committed action plan, why are small achievable habits so effective in a committed action plan? And also, could you explain a little bit what the committed action plan would look like, or what that concept is?
Yeah. So a committed action plan was something that Debbie and I came up with because I see ACT as much about sort of like understanding these concepts, but it's really about applying them, like making it happen in your life. And I have a podcast now called Your Life in Process. And in it, every single podcast at the end, I give an action. Like I say, okay, based on this conversation with Daniel Pink about regret, here is your action for the week to take. Here's how you can live out these values. And it's actually in taking the action that we create the life that we want. So going back to that yoga example, I could look at other people practicing balance poses hours and hours and hours and hours. It's not going to improve my balance pose until I actually fall on my face for hours and hours and hours and hours. And then I'll be a better balancer, right? So the committed action plan is taking these concepts of applying these processes and then putting them into action in your life in the areas that are important to you. Now, the thing about it is that one of the biggest barriers for people in committed action is that their leaps are too big and they give up. Or they do it like 5 times, it's not working, and so they stop. So in order for behaviors, and there's a lot of good behavioral science behind this. I mean, we know sort of like the work in Tiny Habits with BJ Fogg. There's a lot of behavioral science behind this, but we know that small steps, repeated practice that's reinforced. And I would say reinforced by you saying, this is in line with my values, not reinforced by the outcome, right? Because if in that balance pose, if I'm only basing my outcome based on whether or not I did the balance pose, I'm going to give up. If I'm basing my reinforcement on, wow, I was courageous and I tried a balance pose today in yoga, then I'm more likely to try it again next time, right? So we want to be reinforcing small actions that are in line with our values and do it over and over and over and over again. And then you're more likely to get to, hitting some goals maybe that you have for yourself in your life.
You just described my gardening attempt during COVID with the giant leaves and then giving up. And I feel like I could learn something and be like, my value is that I'm growing my own food and that something didn't die today. And I like that example because I totally related to it with like, I'm going to be a homesteader. Like I just jumped and like started 4 garden beds and then everything died and I was surprised because I had never done it before. So I love that it can really apply to anything you're doing, whether big or small. And in your book, you talk about flexible integration. I wondered if you could talk about that and how it ties sort of everything together.
Well, I used the metaphor of the Rubik's Cube at the beginning of our conversation. And when you're working on one side of the Rubik's Cube, what happens to the other sides? Right? So in ACT, even though we broke down these processes into these separate chapters so you can learn one at a time, it's really in working on the dance of all of them at once, which is the flexible integration of being psychologically flexible. And so inherently they're linked. And when you start to, I kind of think of it as like living in an ACT lifestyle these days. When you live in an ACT lifestyle, then acceptance is built in, being present is built in, your values are being built in. You're not necessarily doing them one at a time. You're kind of doing them all together. And they're integrated into the many important domains of your life. It's not just you and your mental health. It's, how are you talking to the person in Trader Joe's right now? Or what are you doing when nobody's looking? And so I see that as flexible integration.
And as we talk about all of the things related to ACT and all the work to be done, why did you feel that a journal format was an effective way to take this on? What about that format appealed to you?
I have read a lot of books in my life and read them passively.
I have too.
Yeah. And thought that they were good ideas and left it at that. So I think I really wanted people to grapple with and try on, this for themselves and do it over a period of time and see what shows up and see how this works and that doesn't work. And, I think that ACT is applied. So journaling is a great way. I've been practicing journaling for a number of years now, and it's built into my morning practice. And journaling is a great way to take perspective on yourself and also keep commitments. It's also a terrible thing to do when you are depressed and you're just ruminating in your problems. So ACT is so this ACT Daily Journal it's a guided journal. It helps give you a little bit of direction so that you're not just sitting there. I mean, I have piles of journals that just say the same thing in them day after day, year after year, right? So I didn't want that, but I wanted people to have a little bit of guidance, but then also bring their own experience to the table. It's not what Diana thinks about psychological flexibility. It's what you feel about psychological flexibility in your life today, in what matters to you. So I think journal is a great avenue for that. And I'm hoping to do more of them.
I was going to say with values as well, like I said earlier, that people kind of stare at a blank page to write them down. A lot of people feel similarly about journaling on a blank page. It can be really overwhelming to know exactly what to write down. And again, like you said, you end up writing the same things over and over again. Or if you're feeling sad or frustrated, you can start to move out of feeling like that's a release and more of like a ruminating place, like you said. So
like the burn book.
Yeah. Really.
I started journaling, a couple of years ago, but I noticed that a lot of the days it's exactly the same. So I like the idea of the guided format because it gives you something to work with. And then you sort of get to where you were trying to go anyway on your own. Diana, I wanted to ask, you talked a lot about how, living in an ACT way is a lifelong process. Can you say a little bit more about that and how people might start or how you can integrate small things into your daily life so it doesn't feel like, your whole day you have to be thinking about all of these things and living by these, 6 processes? How can it look simply in your day?
Well, I just love Sorochi's and Russ Harris's choice point model as a simple practice, which is noticing those choice points, where the moments in your day where maybe you're making contact with something that's painful, or maybe you have that choice, every morning you have a choice of, do you wake up and you go on your phone? Do you wake up and go for a walk? Do you wake up and kiss your partner, right? There's these choice points. How are you going to wake up, right? And in those moments, you can make contact with what matters to you, recognize what would be an away move from your values, what would be an avoidance move, and what would be a towards move. And just ask yourself, what's a towards move, and make a choice. So that's one way that I think is just really simple in ACT is looking at those choice points in your life, or when they show up for you, making that choice. And I also think that ways to bring ACT into your living is it's sort of like life will bring it to you. Life is excruciatingly painful and hard. And so it's not like you have to conjure up situations to use this stuff in. Like you will have situations today that are uncomfortable for you. And when you start to see it as like, oh, I have this toolbox, I have this skill set, I have this thing that could be helpful for me right now. This could be a time to use it. And you start to practice it. Just let life bring you the pain. And then now you have something that, maybe I could just do something as simple as just opening up and allowing for this pain to be here. And what are my values in this moment? getting present with it.
I think that's one thing we can count on, that life will always bring it to us in some way. So I appreciate you saying that. It sounded very poetic as a response, though. And as we wrap up the conversation, Diana, do you have any final thoughts on ACT or your daily journal or anything that we've talked about so far?
I just have one little user comment, because we're a year out from this journal being published, and I've had clients use it. And then I've had a lot of people like talk to me on social media, like on Instagram, I'm using your journal. And one of the things that happens with the ACT Daily Journal is people get inflexible with it. And they think that they need to start at page 1 and do 1 page per day for the next 8 weeks without stopping. And then they get to like the 10th day of using the ACT Daily Journal, and they're kind of just whatever, something shows up and they don't do it. And then they stop. So what I've been telling my clients is okay, first of all, don't do that. Don't be inflexible with your psychologically flexibility journal. But second of all, sometimes I will tell clients, don't do that. But second of all, it's really kind of a cool thing to approach the journal differently than how you would approach something else in your life. Like, what if you opened up to a random page? I'm going to do it right now. Random page. 105. See creatures in pain, hold them lightly. And you did that page today. And you just took that on. And then maybe 3 days from now, you opened to another random page and did that page. What if you actually approached ACT Daily Journal with psychological flexibility? And maybe it would sort of freshen things up for you, and you wouldn't feel like you had to give up after 10 days of it, which is not my goal.
I think that's great, because the irony of being psychologically inflexible with your flexibility journal. And I think that's a really important note too, to let people know that they don't have to start at the first page and work their way through it, and that it can just kind of be picked up as needed and worked through at whatever pace they need.
Yeah, it taps onto the core process that we didn't talk too much about, which is cognitive diffusion, which is your mind before you start a journal has all these rules based on past experiences of journal writing, based on school, what you were told about how to approach things, how you have to read a book from left to right. You can't start a book in the middle. So all these different things that your mind, that you don't even know that your mind has preconceived notions around, step back from a little bit and ask, like, how helpful is that to me? How successful have I been at carrying out that self-help project in the past, right? Maybe if I approached it differently, I could, learn something different. So that's another core process that we didn't talk a lot about, which is just our minds. And if you don't have a problem, your mind will create one for you. So another really useful thing for ACT to help you with is your mind.
Definitely. I think that's a good note to end on. Try something you didn't try before and stop getting stuck in those unnamed rules in your mind. And before we leave this conversation, Diana, is there anything you're up to that you want to share with our listeners?
Yes, I want to let them know that I have a free summit that is coming up, and it has a lot of leaders in the field of ACT, but also contemplative science. And it would be great for folks that are interested in learning more about how to live more psychologically flexible. So Jennifer Payne is on it, who is another New Harbinger author that has a wonderful book out on ACT for racial trauma. I'm going to be speaking on ACT, and it's all about skillful striving. We have Jack Kornfield on it, Dan Siegel, Anna Lemke, Alyssa Epple, some really great leaders in the field of psychology. And you can get it for free at from striving to thriving 2022.com.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
With the ACT Daily Journal, you'll learn about the 6 core processes of acceptance and commitment therapy, including mindfulness, acceptance, and values-based living, and even learn about a 7th, self-compassion. If there was ever a time to adopt the ACT approach to living, it's now. By applying ACT to your life, you'll learn how to roll with life's punches and stay in contact with the present moment, even when you have unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations. The gift of being present is becoming increasingly valuable in these uncertain times of conflict and chaos. It's never been so important to live flexibly, with more meaning, and with a deeper understanding of shared struggles and our inherent humanity. ACT is more than just a therapy. It's a framework for living well. It helps us accept, it teaches us to make a commitment to what we deeply care about, and it works best when practiced daily. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.